Hey guys, so there has been a new major release for Redshift, and it added a really cool new feature that a lot of people have requested over the years, and that is procedural clouds. This is something I've actually wanted for quite some time, also, just because it's really useful for environment scenes. And so this is now available in all DCCs except Maya. I'm pretty sure it'll be in Maya hopefully before the end of the year. Maya it was a little trickier to add this in due to the changes of the new sun and sky for legacy support reasons. But anyways, hopefully by the time you watch this, this will be in every DCC anyways. And the workflow that I'm going to show, this is inside of Houdini, but all these features and parameters, they exist in all the different DCCs. So everything you learn here is going to be applicable inside of 3ds Max or Cinema 4D, eventually Maya, and so on. So anyways, here in the Houdini window, under the Redshift tab, you'll see we have some new icons and some new options here. And you'll see we have Redshift Clouds. So if you click this, we'll get a new Redshift Clouds object. Now, this object also exists inside of LOPS. So if you guys just are inside of LOPS, so if I jump into the stage context and start typing cloud, or RS, where is it? There we go. RS Clouds, you could just drop that in. So it exists in both contexts, for anybody wondering. And in order for the clouds to work, you need to use the new sun and sky rig, which is based on a dome light. This will not work with legacy sun and sky. So just make sure, guys, that you either delete your old sun and sky and make a new one. That's actually one of the reasons why we had to make a new sun and sky with a dome light, so that the new cloud technology would work. And the new sun and sky, it's very similar to what it used to look like, except we've got a couple more contribution controls the same way dome light does, and it works better with the new brute force caustics we got a couple months ago. And so yeah, if we start a rendering, you'll notice the exposure is extremely bright. And this change is due to the fact that Redshift is now scene unit aware. And so certain materials, lights, like the physical sun and sky, are now using more accurate real world values. So in the real world, the sun has a very intense luminance at midday. And generally speaking, with a camera, you want to adjust the exposure to get it within range. There's different ways you could adjust it. You could use EV only mode. There's also what's called the Sunny 16 rule. So if we switch to filmic mode and you set the aperture to 16 and the shutter time to 100, this is considered like a standardized general midday lighting baseline, right? And with a ISO sensitivity of 100. So it's up to you guys how you want to do it. You could play around with it and whatnot. And so you'll notice now we have some clouds in our scene. They're working. And actually, I think the rubber toy doesn't have a shader on assigned. Let's see. Oh no, apparently I do. Okay, so it's just kind of dark. Let's just reset it. Let's look through our camera. And yeah, you guys can see that indeed, the sky is working overall. It's pretty good out of the box. And it just kind of just works. You can see if we face towards the sun, we'll get scattering that occurs, and if we face away, it looks different. So pretty cool. Now, there's quite a lot of parameters with this new cloud object, and so I'm going to cover most of them briefly. I'll kind of explain how some of these work, because it's important to know how they actually function under the hood. So right here in the cloud object, let's open this up a little more. You'll see we have a seed, which is really useful to just randomize the effect, right? And you'll notice as I'm changing things, you'll see that the shadow is changing, and that's because the clouds by default do cast shadows. So you can see there's a switch here called Cloud Shadows. You can disable that if you just want no shadow effect from the clouds, which you might want depending on the scene. So that's what the seed does. Pretty straightforward. There's a density control, so this works just like a volumetric density on the standard volume. If you increase this, you'll see the density of the clouds increased. As I reduce this, you'll see that the clouds are softer. We have a coverage control, and so this controls how much coverage of the clouds exist. So a value of 0 will mean no clouds, and a value of 1 essentially creates a solid box of clouds. Now, this parameter, if I have to explain it in 2D, essentially what's happening, I made this graphic here. I can explain what's essentially happening. So the entire sky is effectively like, just imagine a giant VDB box, solid, and the coverage is a large noise that carves out the overall large shapes and reveals or hides more of the general cloud sky amount. And if you guys want to know about how this noise pattern works and some of the concepts behind this stuff, if you guys just Google, or in this case, DuckDuckGo, Nubis 2 Guerrilla Games, you'll find Andrew Schneider's real-time volumetrics and VFX page. And so he made a really cool presentation for Guerrilla Games discussing these methods in the publication Nubis Cubed. And so there's a PDF, there's presentations, and other stuff you can learn about. Of course, you could also go to the Nubis Evolved page from Guerrilla Games itself, and you'll see there's a presentation, and there's videos on YouTube about this and whatnot. So if you guys are interested in like the technical details of how these noise techniques work, you guys can watch that. And so the concept is pretty straightforward. The coverage will carve out this initial base block, is the way you can think of it. So what ends up happening is as you adjust the coverage, more or less of that large noise carves shapes out. And so if I delete the other noise patterns for now, let's just trim through things. You'll see coverage controls overall this giant shape. And then it gets mixed with scale. So you'll see as I adjust scale, what's essentially happening is this secondary noise shape here is overlaid on top. So what ends up happening is scale is like another noise layer carving our initial coverage cloud shapes. And so as you can see, as I adjust the scale, these patterns or the scaling of the noise is being adjusted. So as I make it really large, you'll see we have effectively zoomed in to this noise pattern if you were to look at it in like 2D. So it'd be like if we zoomed in like this. And as you zoom out, you see more and more of that scale noise. So that's how that works. So let's reset these. And then the third noise we have is detail scale. And so you'll see as I increase this, we zoom in on these edges, you'll see they're very soft. And as I adjust them, we start to get this edge breakup. And as I increase it, that pattern of edge breakup becomes larger. And as I decrease it, these little edge breakups and filaments become smaller. So again, very straightforward. Conceptually, if you were to look at it in 2D, it'd be something like this. So the detail scale is the smaller noise patterns that are carving out the larger scale shapes that were left over from these two. So in a way, you could think of these noise patterns being multiplied on top of each other. And so these three parameters are essentially the most important in terms of building your base shape. And so as you adjust the coverage, you start out with the coverage. You say, hey, I want this many clouds. Do you want sparse clouds, just very few out in the distance? Do you want medium, a lot? Do you want like a full sky? It's up to you to decide. And once you've kind of zeroed in on the general amount you want, you can then adjust the scale to adjust the size of that noise. And then the detail, if you want the clouds to be more like having lots of sharp little details, or do you want the clouds to be soft edged? And so that'll depend on the type of clouds you're trying to generate, right? Like a cumulus cloud is going to look different from a stratus cloud, which is going to be really soft. Now, let's just bring this back down to something a little closer to our defaults. Now, another thing you can do here is adjust the altitude. So this lets you just move the clouds up into the sky or bring them down lower. This parameter is based on meters. By default, it's at 1500 because that's, I would say, in the middle of what cumulus clouds tend to be. They're usually between 1,000 to 2,000 meters in altitude. So 1500 is kind of like a sweet spot. If you guys are aiming to do some really high altitude clouds, you can go up to about 10,000 feet, which is, I believe, where cirrus clouds, or not feet, 10,000 meters, or 10 kilometers. That's the altitude you start to see cirrus type clouds. So, for example, if we did something like 10,000, maybe reduce the coverage kind, you could see this is a little bit closer to what you would expect out of a cirrus high altitude spotty cloud look. Let's bring that back down. Let's rotate a little bit. Actually, the exposure is a little bit extreme. Let's bring that down. Thought I had it. Oh, well. Let's do -5. -4 is around what Sunny 16 is, just so you guys know. Let's do... Let's go down to 90, 80 ISO. That's a little closer to what I'm after. And the next parameter we can talk about here is the thickness. So thickness literally does what it sounds like. It just essentially transforms the incoming cloud and squishes it. So if it's thinner, you'll get these more of a stratus effect. And as you stretch it upward, you get a thicker, almost cumulus, bulbous type shape. So really straightforward. If you were to look at this in 2D, all it's doing is essentially this, where it's compressing it or stretching, but it's not actually changing the shape of the incoming cloud. Rather, it just adjusts or transforms the cloud data itself. And this is also in meters. So if you guys want something that's thin, wispy clouds, you might want to reduce the thickness, because in the real world, Thin wispy clouds like this, the thickness in meters is actually quite low. It could be down to even 10 to 15 meters. And you'll get this sort of wispy, almost cirrus kind of effect, or even like an alto stratus look. If these were meant to be regular stratus clouds, I would probably bring down the altitude even lower, 800 meters, and actually have a high density, or adjust the shader to make them darker. But as you can see, we have a totally different look now than we had earlier, where we have more of a stratus wispy cloud effect instead of a cumulus effect. And that was by adjusting the thickness. Now, the next most important parameter, I would say, besides the coverage, scale, and detail scale, which control the noise pattern, is the shape parameter. So by default, 0.5 means it's kind of in the middle of being cumulus and fully stratus. And so, again, if we refer here to our little graphic, a value of 1 means to make it very bulbous and cumulus shaped, while a value lower towards 0 means make it more of like a stratus soft, almost like a fog shape. So as we reduce our scale here, you'll see how the edge is starting to get soft, and actually it looks like there's a little bug here. Let's see what happens if I increase the thickness. Yeah, so it looks like the thickness was too low. So if we have a regular thickness again, let's do, I don't know, 1500. You'll see how these shapes are rounded or soft edged. And as I increase this shape, you'll see how they start to tower and create this bulbous, let's reduce the coverage a little. This sort of cumulus shape where the bottoms are flatter, and then you get sections that bulge outward like you would get in a cumulus cloud. So that's what the shape parameter is actually controlling. As I reduce this, you'll see that those bulbous tops start to get flatter. And eventually, as I go really low, the cloud itself is relatively flat. So depending on the type of cloud you're after, you're going to want to balance both the shape along with the thickness if you want a little bit of a thinner streaked effect. And again, the default is kind of in between. The default is 0.5, so there's a little bit of bulbous shapes. If we were to stretch out the thickness here, you'll see that it's bulbous, but it's also flat, but not too bulbous. And as I increase this, now we've got these sort of huge bulbous cumulus puffs of cloud that are reaching upward. Let's bring down the sun a little bit so we can get more of a golden hour effect. Let's see. Yeah, let's do -15. I think that's okay. Let's bring up the sensitivity on the ISO just a little bit. Let's reset the altitude, the scale, and the detail scale. So we're back to defaults except for the coverage. Now down here we have our positioning to offset things. So if you like the clouds but maybe you wanted to move them a little bit back, or you wanted to move them, you know, in Z or X, this just lets you shift the entire sky without changing the texture or the patterns. The noises aren't changing, so you'll see as I move this, the clouds stay the same. So that's why you would use this, just to shift the sky around without necessarily making the cloud patterns change. There is another very important parameter in here called wind skew. And so this controls a lot of the look of the clouds. So again, if we bring up this graphic, what wind skew does is essentially at 0, which is the default, it keeps the form of the cloud. As you increase the wind skew, the wind direction begins to smear or push the clouds. So in the real world, because there are different wind speeds at different altitudes, what ends up happening is that higher parts of clouds sometimes can be moving faster than the lower part. And so you start to get this smearing or skewing effect that starts to occur at the higher sections of the cloud before the bottom. And so when we start to increase the wind skew, you'll start to see that effect. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the skew direction is controlled by the wind direction. So if I increase the skew, let's just do something exaggerated, like, I don't know, 5. You'll see how it's all skewing in that direction. And if I change the wind direction control, you'll see we're able to rotate which direction that skewing effect is occurring. Now, I do want to mention, guys, a lot of these parameters, just because you can slide 0 to 1 doesn't mean it ends at 0 to 1. So, for example, the default wind skew, I think, is only 0 to 1. But like I just showed you, you can actually punch in higher values. So wind skew is pretty cool. I think, generally speaking, a value of 0.3 is pretty good. It adds that little extra just detail to edges that you might not see normally. And then you could shift the direction of the skew using the wind direction. Then this wind skew is also going to change as your wind speed changes. So by default, the wind isn't going to move. If you change your render frame, nothing happens, right? Because by default, wind speed is 0. As you increase wind speed, so let's just do 10, which is pretty strong. And now we start going through our keyframes, or just moving the timeline, actually. You don't even have to keyframe it. You'll see the sky is moving now. And so there's 2 parameters that control how the clouds are moving through the sky noise and evolving. Wind speed, so let's just do something strong. Let's just do 200. Wind speed controls how the clouds as a whole are moving across the sky. So you can see as I move, you'll see all the clouds move. And then the wind direction, like we mentioned earlier, that controls which way the clouds are going to be sliding across the sky. But if we zoom in, you'll notice something interesting here. As the cloud moves, it looks like it's just traveling through the noise. But these little edge details are not evolving also. So you can actually control how fast the edge details also change through time. So by default, again, just like wind speed, it's at 0. But if you do something higher, let's just say 10, and I start moving, you'll see how it's moving and changing very rapidly now. And this is because not only are the clouds moving through the sky as a whole, but the micro noise from this detail scale that we were talking about earlier is now moving together. And so it's changing very quickly the silhouette or edge shape of the clouds. So generally, you want to balance the two, depending on the speed or the effect you're after, like a time lapse, or do you want a slow movement of the sky? So in this case, I might want to do something like, I don't know, 1 or something. And as I start moving, you'll see here not only is the cloud moving through the sky, but this detail started changing. Let's try maybe a little stronger value, 2. Let's see how that looks. Okay, there we go. So you'll see the overall shape is moving, but the detail is also moving. Let's try something in between, 1.5. Okay, there we go, cool. So you can see how now it's evolving a little nicer. We're getting these big pieces of the cloud moving across the sky, but also these smaller details start to appear and disappear and dissipate and break up, because now both the detail phase and the wind speed are working together to break up how the clouds are changing as time passes. So really cool. So as you can see, it's quite flexible in terms of how you're going to control and manipulate the direction, how the clouds are changing, the color. We'll discuss in a bit. But in terms of the lighting, it all just works. So if we start facing the sun, you'll see here we've got, the shadows and the scattering and all that stuff sort of just working. Now, in terms of adjusting how the clouds themselves look, in terms of shading, not the actual formation of the clouds, we have this whole section down here at the bottom. By default, they're pretty good. I honestly wouldn't mess with them unless you need a specific look. But there are some important considerations to talk about here. Now, of course, if you guys are used to volume shading, you'll recognize some of these parameters here. There's the scatter color. If I change this, it's going to change the color of the clouds. The scatter scale. So as I reduce this, you'll see the clouds get darker. Again, you can go past 0 to 1. You can go up to 2, 5, whatever. There's an anisotropy control. So you can make the clouds back scatter or forward scatter towards the light. Generally speaking, clouds in the real world forward scatter. Depending on the type that they are, they can forward scatter more or less. Cumulus clouds tend to not be so strong versus wispy or stratus and cirrus clouds, which will have a very high anisotropy strength. In general, I find that 0.4 is pretty good for like the default cumulus type of look. Now, at the bottom here, we have these sort of controls to adjust the direct lighting. So let's rotate around again. The direct lighting controls the direct light that you're seeing, the illumination. So if I reduce this, the clouds just get really dim. As I increase this, the direct light is very bright. The ambient light you can think of as like the GI in these darker pockets. So as I reduce this, you'll see the underbelly of the clouds are quite dark. As I increase this, it gets brighter. So quite flexible, again, depending on the type of cloud you're working on or you're trying to create. You're going to maybe want to make it darker or lighter. And then below we have the transparency, and these parameters will control how the light is traveling into the cloud and then falling off. So if I increase or decrease the depth, you'll see this is similar to the density, but it's not quite the same. And if I increase this, you'll see more of the light is entering into the cloud and scattering around. We also have a shadow density scale. So you'll see this softens the shadows. So this can be useful to give more of that soft less defined cloud look, where you have a softer, more of a nimbus stratus type effect. Now, there is a section called optimizations. This adds a couple important optimizations depending on things you might encounter. Like I mentioned previously, we have cloud shadows, so you'll see that cloud shadows affect everything. We have a horizon blend. So if we zoom in here, you'll see we have towards the horizon line, there is a blend we can control where it blends away the clouds into the distance. Again, pretty straightforward. And we have a cloud quality. And so this cloud quality, what it's actually doing under the hood is adjusting the ray marching and the resolution of the noises that are being used. Generally speaking, I don't ever really go over 2. You can go up to like 20, but it's going to be a lot slower. So but it does make a difference. So if we save a screenshot and let's just set this to 2, you'll see we got more detail in the way that the shadows are being generated. And so the ray marcher detail and the noise detail is a little bit higher. For final frame, I would suggest, switching to 2. 1 is really fast. The performance you lose going to 2 is negligible, really, and worth the little extra quality. You can go down lower if for some reason it's, you don't really care, and you'll see how the quality is getting really rough and soft. But maybe this is something you're after, like you want something more painterly. Oops. So that is an option. And then we have the hex tiling switch. So in many cases, you won't notice the repetition of the noises. But in some cases, if you have a low scale, and let's reduce the thickness, and let's rotate around the camera, we might find a place where this will become visible. Okay, so right here. So you'll see, you could start seeing the noise repetition going into the horizon, right? So if you're working on a scene that has little puffs of clouds, and you're starting to notice, hey, there's this weird little pattern towards the horizon you start to see, you can just turn on hex tiling. It will make things a little slower. That's why we don't enable it by default in Redshift. But if you do end up seeing this pattern, just turn that on and it gets rid of it. And your problem's solved. So this is useful to have in these scenarios where you have lots of smaller clouds. And we do plan on adding a high altitude layer with cirrus cloud shapes and maybe cirrocumulus shapes like this as a noise, so that you can have both a large scale cloud layer with a high altitude cirrus layer on top blended behind these clouds in the near future. It's not ready yet, but just so you guys know, it is being worked on. And we also have plans in the future to let you make more than one of these. So you can then layer maybe, I don't know, 3 or whatever we end up being able to do. And so that'll allow you to layer multiple different types of clouds, right? So maybe you want something like this mixed with little ones and mixed with more of a stratus shape. Who knows, right? It's up to you guys to art direct it and kind of have fun with it. So if you wanted something that's more of a stratus look, maybe you're going to do something like 0.1, and we're going to reduce the thickness. We'll bring down the altitude, and maybe we'll have less scattering. So it's something like this. Who knows, right? But as you can imagine, there's quite a lot of flexibility. So if you guys find something that's cool on the internet as a reference, just kind of just start tweaking these parameters, and it won't be too hard. You'll eventually get to something that's pretty similar. Okay, cool. Now the last feature that I have to discuss here, and that is the volumetric clouds. So this mode, right now, all these clouds only exist in the actual environment or dome light. So if you don't have the physical sun or infinitely far away object, these will not work. And what do I mean by that? I mean, if I disable this and I make a dome light, this will actually still work. Let's just load up some random HDR here. Let's make sure our sun is disabled. Let's turn it back on. You'll see the clouds are actually still there with the dome light, which is kind of cool. So if you guys have a dome light you want to use, you can actually composite those clouds on top of them, which is neat. Nice little extra feature there. But these clouds only exist in that environment right now. So you can't actually fly into the clouds, right? Like they don't exist in our scene. But if you turn on volumetric mode, this will make the clouds actual 3D volumetric, essentially a VDB scene, object in your scene. But once you start working with volumetric clouds, your shading has to change. You're going to have to start thinking more like you're shading an actual VDB cloud. And when you're shading a VDB cloud, what's really important is the scatter and multi-scatter, right? So let's find another angle here. And in this case, actually, the clouds do exist in our scene. So if I zoom out far enough, see if I can start to see them. You'll see that they're actually there. So if you want, you can technically fly into these clouds now. Or place objects into them. You can fly the camera into them. They're actual VDB or volume data in your scene, I should say. They're not actually VDB files. But they are significantly slower, so that's one of the downsides, because this is now a real volume. But they have the advantage of being real 3D clouds. And so to get a nice cloud, I recommend you just look at the documentation about cloud shading in the Redshift docs that I put together that will explain kind of what's a good starting point. But essentially, it's pretty straightforward. One of the first things you got to do is go into the render globals, and you're going to need volumes to actually be multi-scatter, because a single scatter is going to not work really for clouds. So let's just try something like 24. And here, in terms of the scatter color, we're going to want this to be white. The scatter scale, I generally tend to like something between 1.1 to 1.3. Just depends. So see, it started bumping up a little bit more. The color here, we want it to actually reflect back a lot of white. So we're going to do 0.01. So 0.01. You'll notice now we're getting those white edges. The depth, let's try a value of 5. Give it a little softer edge. Oh, and I forgot the here the combined bounce rate needs to go up also. Let's just set it to 30. Let's hit reload in case some stuff didn't update. Okay, cool. And here we can control the multi-scatter, anisotropy, and extinction fall-offs, the starting rate. By default, it's a pretty good setting. I wouldn't worry too much about that. But we could adjust the shadow density scale to make these shadows softer. Let's try something like, I don't know, 0.4. So see, now we've got these softer shadows. Let's use a 0.4 for the anisotropy. And so now if we start facing the sun, you'll see we start getting more interesting sort of effects from the anisotropy, where the edges get highlighted stronger than the cores. Let's increase the coverage a little bit. This is going to make it quite a bit worse, though, because there's a lot more stuff going on. And let's come down here again, and let's make some slight adjustments. Let's increase the scatter a bit more. Let's reduce the shadow density further so we get softer shadows inside of there. Yeah, and that's where we're at. Now it's a volumetric cloud type, but it's significantly slower to render. If you were to render this, it's basically like rendering an actual VDB. And as some of you guys may know, rendering volumes with a lot of bounces like this is pretty rough. But it looks nicer. So that is one of the benefits. This is a true volume. You can actually fly into them. You could put an object in. So if you had a mountain, these clouds would actually be in front of the mountain. So it's up to you, to decide when to use what. In some cases, it might make sense. In other cases, it might not make sense for you to go down this route. So it really just depends. Cool. And like I mentioned, though, these sort of shader settings, you're thinking now 3D volume shading. You're not thinking 2D, which is what we had before. So previously, it's using a lot of tricks to have a pseudo multi-scatter effect. Right now, we're doing the real thing. This is actually multi-scattering inside of this volume and ray marching the volume. So it's up to you as a user to decide when to use which version. 9 times out of 10, I would say just stick to the 2D mode unless you need an object to actually interpenetrate into the clouds, or you need to, for whatever reason, fly through clouds like this. Then, resort to volumetric mode. But in most cases, I would say just stick to the 2D mode. And as you can see, we need to adjust our shader back to essentially defaults. To get back to sort of the effect we wanted with the 2D mode. And so the 2D mode fakes a lot of that multi-scatter using some tricks. But as you can see, it's a lot faster, right? So it's up to you as a user to decide when to use which. Hopefully in the future, when we're able to make multiple layers and also have a high altitude layer of cirrus, then the quality would be pretty good for most cases where you just need filler clouds in a background, if you don't have a particular HDR. Now, one of the last things I want to mention is the cloud is actually being influenced by the sky. in terms of also the sky ground. So if I change this ground color on the sky here, let's just do something ridiculously bright like red, you'll see that the clouds are actually being affected because the ground plane, if we were to zoom out, is also red. So, and this is true in the real world. When you look at photography of clouds and stuff over an ocean, you'll see that the underbelly of the clouds tends to be more on the blue side. It's like desaturated deep blues. Versus if it's a desert, you're going to get more of a yellowy sort of effect, a brownish yellow. So keep that in mind. The ground color of the physical sun and sky does affect the look. By default, it's a neutral gray color, so it gives off this sort of grayish effect. But if you guys are working on like a landscape that's in a jungle or whatever, then you will want to adjust this to sort of compensate for that global illumination that's bouncing off the terrain and back into the clouds. And like I said, if you guys look at photography, you'll notice that that occurs depending on what color the overall average of the landscape is. Yeah, so hopefully, you know, you guys now understand how the cloud system works. It's really cool. And that was weird. It like glitched out for a split second there. This is new, so there might be bugs, guys. But if you run into any problems, please report them. And yeah, let's just wrap it up. Let's just do a sunset. -5. Have our little rubber toy facing the sun. Let's bring up the ISO, maybe 200. Yeah, you know, as you can imagine, if we render this out, we'll get this cool little time-lapse animation sort of moving across the sky. So really fun new feature, easy to use, lots of control, which is awesome. I like that we're able to adjust all these shaping parameters, all the shading, so you can do all sorts of interesting effects if you want a different look. Adjust the ambient scale of the way that the clouds are being lit. If you want them to be more like rain clouds, you can make them darker. You know, you can make weird colored clouds if you're working on something that's more NPR instead of PBR based. You can blend the horizon if you want the clouds to be blended further. Oh, and one last thing I actually forgot to mention about the volumetric clouds. Because the volumetric clouds are real clouds in your scene, the camera clipping does matter. So you need the camera clip to be far enough. You'll notice how we don't have any clouds in the horizon anymore. So if we change the far clip to, let's just say 100,000, they showed up. And that's because volumes that are being ray marched in actual 3D space, like the clouds are in volume mode, they base the distance of the ray marching on the far camera clip plane. So just be aware of that, guys, in case you turn it on and you're wondering, hey, what happened to my clouds in the horizon? It's because your camera clip, far clip, needs to be large enough to capture that. That's not a problem when you're using 2D mode, though. That's only an issue you got to deal with when you're working with volumetric mode. But yeah, that should cover basically everything you need to know. The cloud tool is awesome. It's here. Finally, you can get some really cool sunsets and all sorts of interesting lighting scenarios now. It does work with the global fog. So if you turn on the global fog, you will get, depending on how your setup is and the fog setup is, you could get God rays at times. They'll be subtle, but you will see them. And yeah, that's basically everything you guys need to know about the new cloud object inside of Redshift. Thanks again, guys, for all the support on YouTube and Patreon, and I hope you have a wonderful day.